Hello, Old Testament intro students. I am here to make another video for you on the post-exilic prophets that you are now working through. Um, it really is important. I think I've said this in the previous video, and I think I've highlighted it in hopefully my assignments for you, that you are able to plug in the various prophets in their correct time periods and settings so you'll understand what you're reading. The post-exilic prophets I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes or so. And by post-exilic prophets, I am referring to Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, Jonah, and Malachi, otherwise known as Malachi, which you haven't done yet. You're working on Joel and Jonah now, and then I'll say a few things about Malachi, and then that'll be your last assignment with some other stuff. All of these prophets, these five prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Joel, Jonah, they are all post-exilic prophets. The writing is post-exilic prophet. Jonah is a little different, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But as far as the other four, because they are post-exilic works, you have to realize, if you understand the history, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 721 by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted until 587, and then with Nebuchadnezzar in 587, the people of Judah went into exile. Okay? And then in 539, they came out. That's why the people who came out of the exile were the people of the kingdom of Judah. That's where we get the name Jews from. Before the exile, most of Old Testament history was Israel and Judah, but you're not going to see the term Jews used in 1 Kings or 1 Samuel because that wasn't a thing yet. We get the term Jews from the fact that it was the people from the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, who came out of the exile, and they kept going on. That's where we get the term Jews from Judah. So Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi, and Jonah are all works from the post-exilic Judean community who's come out of exile. Now, the textbook doesn't mention a couple of these things that I'm about to tell you, but it's really important to understand them if you want to understand the message, the purpose of the message. If you go back to Ezekiel and that prophecy of the valley of dry bones, where Ezekiel sees all these dead bones in the valley, Israel or Judah in exile, and God says, prophesy over the bones, and the bones come back to life, and they're an army, and it's a prophecy that God would resurrect his people from the exile. They were dead as a nation. He's going to metaphorically resurrect them as a nation and bring them back to the land. Okay, so in 539, when Cyrus decrees that all people can go back to their homeland, this is it. That's the fulfillment of that prophecy, so to speak. The people of Judah start coming back to the land. They are the resurrected people of God, resurrected from the exile. Now, another thing to keep in mind is in Jeremiah 31, when he prophesies about my people are going to go into exile because they broke the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, but there will be a time in the latter end times, the latter days, when I will make a new covenant with my people. It will not be like the old covenant. This covenant will have the Torah written on their hearts. So what you get when they come out of exile is this idea that they're the resurrected people of God coming out of the exile. But because the Mosaic covenant was broken, when they come out, what's the new covenant going to look like? What does the resurrected people of God look like? How are they supposed to live? Are they supposed to just go back to trying to obey the Mosaic covenant? Or is that broken? Are they trying to do something new? And on top of that, you get a number of prophecies in Isaiah and Zechariah and Jeremiah, and what you see in Daniel is that despite them going into exile in the first place, that God's name is becoming known among the Gentiles. And so when they come back out of exile to the land, there's a fundamental question that I think the textbook doesn't even capture enough, and I think it's really fundamental, is when they come out of exile, there's that fundamental question: what are the resurrected people of God going to look like? Go back to the Torah. If these Gentiles want to come in or they want to attack, what does it look like? And that is an unresolved question by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament. And that, by the way, is what leads you eventually to the New Testament. What is the resurrected people of God going to look like? What's the new covenant going to look like? It's not yet resolved by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament. And then when you do get to the New Testament, all of a sudden you have this small little Jewish following of this guy named Jesus claiming to be the true Israel, and they're reaching out to Gentiles, and they're actually trying to answer that unresolved question ever since the exile. What's new going to happen? So, but that is all what you see when you read Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi, and Jonah, and even Ezra and Nehemiah, if you remember. They're trying to wrestle with that question. So with that, let me walk you through very quickly just some of the background things of these prophets. Again, you've done the textbook questions, so some of this should be a little review. By the way, the very last assignment I'm going to give you on Malachi, I'm going to try to, because I haven't done it that much this semester, I'm going to try to include a couple of actual passages to look at from a variety of these post-exilic prophets, and we'll work through those. Okay. Haggai and Zechariah, they're kind of like twins, so to speak. They're prophesying largely at the same time. And to understand their significance, you have to understand that timeline of when the Jews came out of the exile. 539, the textbook says 538. Okay. 539, Cyrus says people can go back to their homeland. And the first batch of the Jews under Sheshbazzar, I can't say the name, he was some kind of royal prince in the Davidic line. He led them back to Judah to start the Judean Jewish community there. That happens in 539, okay? We're told about 40,000-ish Jews went back. Now, the textbook doesn't go into all the details, but I'm going to give you a few more dates here. So they come back in 539. Within a year, in 538, the Jews in Jerusalem lay the foundation for the new temple because they want to build a new temple. But it gets kind of delayed. And in 529, well, 8-9 years later, a new Persian ruler comes to the throne. It says, I think in Ezra, it says it's Artaxerxes. There could be a name problem. It could be a Cambyses. I can't ever say this guy's name. Cambyses. You don't have to know the name, but just know when Cyrus died, the new Persian king comes to the throne. And what had been going on in Judah is when the Jews came back, they were met with people who were living in the land. Okay, some of them were, Samaritans, just Arabs, just different kinds of people. And these returning exiles were trying to build their community, and they wanted to keep all these other people out. You kind of read about that in the early part of Ezra. Well, some of the people of the land who weren't part of the Jewish community, they were kind of, not literal, maybe they were literally fighting, but they were at loggerheads with the returning community. And so the people of the land send a letter to the new Persian king, and they basically say, hey, these Jews, they're trying to rebuild the temple, and you better stop them because they've been always rebellious, and if they rebuild the temple, they're going to get rebellious against you too. And therefore, the Persian king orders in 529 that they stop building the temple. Just stop it. You're not allowed to rebuild the temple. And it stays that way until 520. That is when Haggai and Zechariah start to prophesy and tell the Jews, you got to start building the temple. Okay, and the reason why they did that is because just a couple of years earlier in 522, yet another Persian king, King Darius, came to the throne. And when he came to the throne, it was kind of a new opportunity. And that's why Haggai and Zechariah said, let's start rebuilding the temple without asking for permission. And basically they got away with it. I think I covered that in Ezra. But when Darius came to the throne, Haggai and Zechariah start to prophesy about rebuilding the temple. and they start rebuilding the temple in 520, and then finally in 516, roughly 4 years later, the new temple is rebuilt. That's the historical background to Haggai and the first half of Zechariah. Now, you already did the homework. All of Haggai's prophecies were dated specifically to the day. So come August 29th, you could all have a celebratory meal for Haggai's first prophecy, the anniversary. But they're all dated, and it's all pretty straightforward. They call the Jews to repentance for not rebuilding the temple. They challenge them to rebuild the temple. They challenge them to hearken back to the covenant. If you rebuild the temple, God's blessings will flow back to you and we'll all be good. And the promise of the full restoration will come. Because you have to remember, when the Jews came back, they were expecting all this wonderful things to happen for them, and they weren't happening. So they thought, okay, what do we got to do to get God to bless us again? Let's finish rebuilding the temple. And then with Ezra and Nehemiah, it was all, let's really get going on Torah obedience as well. But anyway, in Haggai, that's really the emphasis. And in the fourth prophecy, he mentions Zerubbabel, who is the Davidic servant, and he calls Yahweh's signet ring. There's this idea that somehow God is going to work through a rebuilt temple and a Jewish ruler to bring about the full restoration. That's basically what Haggai is about. Now, when you get to Zechariah, the first half of Zechariah kind of largely is the same themes. So I'm not going to necessarily tell you what I just told you. But the unique thing about Zechariah is really takes place from the first 6 chapters. Well, it's all of it, but he has all these different visions. I'm not going to go through them all, but they all get to the point of in trying to inspire the people of the Jews, the returning exiles, to rebuild the temple. Because if you rebuild the temple, that is how God is going to restore his people and consequently be a light to the Gentiles. So that's what a lot of the visions in Zechariah really go to. And specifically, if you look at vision number 4 in chapter 4, he sees this vision of a lampstand and 2 olive trees. The 2 olive trees symbolize Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest. And the idea is God's going to work through these 2 guys, the priesthood and the kingship, or the royal line, to bring about his restoration. And then at the end, in chapter 6, 9 through 15, he has another vision where Joshua, the high priest, is crowned, which is really interesting because all of a sudden the picture is then of a priest king through whom God is going to bring about restoration. And that has implications eventually when you get to the New Testament as well. But again, that first half of Zechariah really follows the same themes of Haggai. Rebuild the temple, God's blessings will flow, God's restoration will happen, but be sincere. The second half of Zechariah is the crazy apocalyptic stuff. And there's no way I can adequately explain all that stuff to you in a short 20-minute video, only part of which is devoted to Zechariah. But what you get in the apocalyptic stuff, let me try to explain this as easiest I can. When you go back to much of the Old Testament prophecies, prophets are different than apocalyptic guys. The prophets would prophesy God's message to the people at that time, and occasionally they would look forward to a future time within history when God would act, specifically the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, whatever you want to call it. And in the prophets, there were a lot of days of the Lord when the northern kingdom was going to be destroyed by Assyria. Amos prophesied that the day of the Lord is coming, and it's going to be a day of darkness for the kingdom of Israel. So the day of the Lord always represented vindication for his people and judgment against the enemies of God's people. And therefore, sometimes it was the focus of God's wrath was the northern kingdom. Then it was Assyria. And then when the southern kingdom in Jerusalem was destroyed in 587, Jeremiah uses Day of the Lord imagery to denote that, because it's like your world is being upended, that kind of thing. And then Babylon will suffer a day of the Lord. But all the days of the Lord that the prophets talked about were events in history. Now, when the exiles came out of exile and they were expecting that God would restore them, give them a new Davidic king, a brand new awesome temple, they would be rulers again, everything would be great. But it didn't happen all of a sudden, right away. And because it didn't happen, because that element of some of the prophecies had not yet been fulfilled, after the exile, the post-exilic period, some people, the apocalyptic writers, they were looking at these prophecies that had not yet been fulfilled about their full restoration. And they came to the conclusion that these prophecies were really about the ultimate restoration of all of creation that would happen at the end of history, not just a date within history. And therefore, these apocalyptic visions used a lot of Old Testament imagery, a lot of Day of the Lord, cosmic upheaval language, but they looked forward to a time at the end of history when the Messiah would come and the old age would completely dissolve and go away, and a whole new creation would happen at the end of history. And therefore, that's why there's a lot of crazy imagery, going on in these apocalyptic oracles. So that's kind of what you get in Zechariah 9 through 14. In those chapters, chapter 9, it talks about a messianic ruler coming riding on a donkey. That's alluded to in the Gospels when Jesus comes into Jerusalem. When that happens, when the Messiah comes, humble, God's restoration will happen. But he'll defeat his enemies, and Israel will eventually, be fully restored and will rule the world. But again, if you keep that very general idea in mind when you read 9 through 14, a lot of it's going to be pretty hard to understand, but that's kind of what it's getting at. All right, now, the new stuff. Let me say a few quick words about Joel. Joel is an interesting book because we don't really know when it was written. There is no specific date mentioned in Joel, but scholars, and you read this in your textbook, most scholars think Joel is a post-exilic work because he's addressing the elders. And therefore, the fact that he's addressing the elders would imply that there's no kingship, and there was no kingship after the exile. So most scholars think it was probably, written later on the 6th, maybe 5th century or so. And it really focuses on repentance, the locust plague associated with Joel. There's probably a literal locust plague, but Joel takes that literal locust plague and uses it as a metaphor for God's coming wrath and judgment before the day of the Lord. Okay, so he calls them to repentance. And perhaps the most interesting part of Joel, if you want to do Old Testament, New Testament connections, is in chapter 2, 28 to 32, where Joel looks forward to a time after God's judgment happens, but still before the day of the Lord. So God's judgment will happen before that ultimate day of the Lord happens. There's going to be a time when he's going to pour out his spirit on all flesh. And so, that part is quoted by Peter at the day of Pentecost. At the day of Pentecost, Peter says what was happening at Pentecost is a fulfillment of what Joel was saying. Before the day of the Lord ultimately comes, at some point, God's going to pour out his spirit on all flesh, and the word will go out throughout all the world that, God is the true God. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting thing about Joel. But the things you have to know, it's a post-exilic work. That's kind of a New Testament connection. Now, I want to say a few things about Jonah. I could talk all day about Jonah. I did my master's thesis on Jonah, but I'm going to try to limit it to about 5 or 10 minutes. Quite frankly, I think the textbook doesn't do Jonah justice, and I'm going to have to just give you the highlights. The prophet Jonah, the historical prophet Jonah, lived in the early, 8th century he's a northern prophet, so this is a pre-exilic prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel, living during the time of Jeroboam II, who was a very powerful, very successful king in the northern kingdom. And Jonah is mentioned in 2 Kings 14, I believe. But here's the interesting thing. The historical prophet lived then. The book of Jonah is clearly a post-exilic work of the southern kingdom, which is really interesting. So it's a post-exilic southern work about a pre-exilic northern prophet, but the message is directed to the returning exiles. And there's a lot to it, but basically, here we go. When you read Jonah, everybody knows the story of Jonah, and he runs away from God, and there's the big fish, and then eventually Nineveh repents, and Jonah's mad. But there's a lot of stuff going on in Jonah that I think is directly relevant to the post-exilic Jewish community. You have to remember that Jonah the prophet in the story is told to go to Nineveh and to pronounce judgment upon Nineveh. But Jonah doesn't want to do that. We're not told why at the beginning, but he rejects that. He's rebellious and he goes away. Goes on a ship over the sea. Now you have to realize Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Assyria was the empire that destroyed the northern kingdom. Okay, so if you're reading this from a post-exilic Jewish perspective, you already know the historical story. So this story in Jonah is a really odd story. All of a sudden, I realize it's getting dark here. Hold on. And so the story is kind of an interesting story that Jonah runs away. Now, I should have said this early on. I don't think the book of Jonah is meant to be read as a historical event. I think it's more like a parable, and I'll explain that why. And the bizarre things in Jonah lead to it being not, you shouldn't take it as a historical event. But there's a message to it. But Jonah rebels, runs away, is on the boat. God sends the storm on the sea. We all know what happens. The pagan sailors don't know what's going on. They wake him up. And he says, yeah, I'm a prophet. I'm a Hebrew. I'm rebelling. Throw me over. And they don't want to. But they eventually do. As soon as he's thrown overboard, everything calms down. And at the end of chapter 1, we are told that these pagan sailors worship Yahweh. So in a weird twist, Jonah's rebellion has brought the knowledge of Yahweh to Gentiles who acknowledge who Yahweh is. Jonah is swallowed by a big fish. If you understand the mythological imagery of the Sea of Chaos and the great sea serpent, of evil, this is kind of a parody of that. He goes down into the sea, not just the Mediterranean Sea, but if you read chapter 2, he starts talking about, I've gone down to the belly of Sheol, creature, sea serpent language. So he's gone down into death. And Jonah's prayer in chapter 2 is not one of repentance. He doesn't say he's sorry. He basically says, I know you're going to, I praise you because I know you're going to save me. Kind of arrogant. And God then tells the big fish to vomit Jonah up onto the dry land. And then by chapter 3, Jonah says, okay, fine, I'll go to Nineveh. He goes to Nineveh, gives his message. It's interesting that he's in the belly of the beast for 3 days and 3 nights, I think. And then when he goes to Nineveh, we're told that he goes into Nineveh for 3 days. So there's kind of a parallel there. And he goes to Nineveh. Nineveh says in 40 days, Nineveh is going to get destroyed. 40 is a important number in the Old Testament. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights during the flood when God brought his judgment on the world. Moses, after the Hebrews rebel with the golden calf, he goes up Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and he fasts on behalf of the people. Elijah, after he confronts the prophets of Baal, and Jezebel says, I'm going to get you. He runs away to Sinai, and it takes him 40 days to get there, where during the time he doesn't eat or drink anything. Okay? Keep that in mind. We're not going to go to the New Testament stuff there. With that in the background, when Jonah gives his prophecy, shockingly, the Ninevites listen to him. And the king of Nineveh decrees that everyone fast, basically during that time of 40 days before the judgment comes. So everybody in Nineveh fast without drinking or eating anything. Even the animals and even the beasts, man and beast, they all fast for 40 days and 40 nights. Fat and dressed in sackcloth and ashes. That's a symbolic thing to do. Basically, when you fast and you put down sackcloth and ashes, you're admitting that you deserve the punishment, but you're asking for mercy. Basically, that's what's going on in Nineveh. And at the end of 40 days, we're told that God decides to relent. He's not going to destroy them. And so the Ninevites repent and they're spared. They're shown God's grace. Okay? And this ticks Jonah off. And at the beginning of chapter 4, Jonah storms out and he says, "This is why I didn't want to come to Nineveh in the first place, because I knew you were a loving and gracious God, full of compassion." And he's quoting Exodus 34, I want to say 5 and 6. The passage, now you have to understand that passage. That's the golden calf scene. After 40 days, when Moses convinces God not to destroy the Hebrews for their sin, and God gives him 2 new tablets, he kind of gives what I call like a new preface to the tablets, in which he basically tells the Hebrews in the desert, the only reason you're getting a second chance, because I'm a gracious and compassionate God. I'm faithful to my covenant. Okay? So here's the difference. In the Exodus story, the Hebrews were extended grace and hesed because Moses fasted for 40 days and 40 nights on their behalf. But they didn't deserve it, but they were shown grace anyway. Here in the Jonah story, the Ninevites, the hated Ninevites, they themselves actually do the fasting for 40 days, and God shows grace to them, shows hesed to them, and Jonah doesn't like it. He just wants God to forgive him. And the Israelites, even though they're cocky and they don't deserve it, but not the Ninevites, because they're bad. All right? And so Jonah, and there's so much more to the story. Jonah goes outside east of the city and he builds the little booth, but it doesn't shade him. And then the tree comes up and there's that whole odd thing. And eventually the tree dies and Jonah's angry and he just wants to die. And the story ends with God telling Jonah basically, you got upset over the fact that this plant died. You didn't plant it, and you're angry over it. You had compassion over the plant. You cared about the plant. And then God says, shouldn't I have compassion over all these people in Nineveh? Okay? And then that's the end of the story. We're not told how Jonah responds, and that's the point. That's the parable-like nature of the story. Because at the end, you want to know what Jonah does, but at the end, you realize, oh, I'm Jonah, especially if you're a post-exilic Jew. And you're confronted with this, what do I do with these? How do I relate to these Gentiles? What if Gentiles come to a knowledge of Yahweh? Do we kick them out? Do we embrace them? How does the resurrected people of God, what are they going to look like? Because there are some Old Testament prophets like Isaiah and parts of Zechariah and Jeremiah that talk about Gentiles somehow coming in. And so here's the point of the Jonah story, is I think it's a pointed parable challenge to the post-exilic community to say, you guys, if you repel Gentiles and you want to build your own temple and keep in your own isolated bubble, nationalistic bubble, and have nothing to do with the outside world, you're like Jonah. And Jonah wasn't a good guy. Salvation and Hesed is happening where anybody, in this case, the shocking thing, the Ninevites are repenting. God is extending his Hesed to even people who are not Jews. And you should welcome that, because that's where salvation happens. And so that's the challenge to the book of Jonah. Now, having said all that, that's why I don't think the book of Jonah is meant to be a historical account. Let's face it, there's too many bizarre things going on. And that's okay. Just because if it's not a historical account doesn't mean it's not true. If you understand it's a parable, I think it's a parable, I think you could learn the lesson. A parable in the post-exilic setting, I think, is pretty cool. Chew on that. Read over Jonah. Think about it. It's good. All right. Finally, Malachi is the last book in our Old Testament. You're going to be reading about that next. It's pretty straightforward when you do get the assignment for that. The big thing you want to that you want to be looking for in Malachi, it addresses a lot of issues that kind of relate to Ezra, the issues Ezra and Nehemiah were dealing with. Should you intermarry with foreigners? The question of divorce, abuses by the priesthood, how to do temple services, tithing, Sabbath, the oppression of the poor. But the big concern in Malachi is the keeping the covenant with Yahweh. And Malachi looks forward to the coming of the prophet Elijah before the great day of the Lord. Again, he's not saying Elijah is going to get reincarnated. He's not going to come back to life. But the idea is before the coming day of the Lord, there will be a prophet of some sort who's going to prepare the way for the day of the Lord. And Malachi kind of talks about this near the end, specifically in chapter 4. And so his concluding remarks is to remember Moses, remember the covenant, stay faithful to the covenant, and basically look for Elijah. That's an important New Testament thing, because when John the Baptist comes on the scene in the Synoptic Gospels, he's dressed and he's meant to resemble Elijah. So if you are a Jew and you know your Old Testament, and you know that before the great day of the Lord happens, there will be a prophet like Elijah to come and prepare the way, and all of a sudden there's a prophet like Elijah declaring the way of the Lord's coming, your ears are going to perk up. So that's what, when you get to the New Testament, that's where they get it from. It's both in Isaiah, but also here in Malachi. Okay, I've blathered on long enough. Hopefully that gives you some heads up on what to expect and look for in these prophets, and we'll keep it there. All right, thank you. 30 minutes, not bad.